In this video, we're gonna discuss lenses. Now, this is not a tutorial for photographers, so we're not gonna be going nuts, but I will tell you everything you need to know about lenses. We're gonna be also talking about depth of field, angles, perspective, distortions, chromatic aberrations, and so on and so forth, because that's all related to lenses. So after this video, you should be able to easily operate with camera in Blender, okay? So first of all, we have different types of lenses. We have zoom lenses and prime lenses. Now, zoom lenses are cheaper usually, and you can zoom them manually. So they have a sort of adjustable focal length like this one, 10 to 18 millimeters, you see here on the bottom, right? Now, there are also prime lenses like this very expensive Otus here, which is 85 millimeter 1.4 aperture lens. And this lens cannot be zoomed, okay? You need to zoom with your feet. These are usually bigger, they have more glass, and they are much more expensive. They usually used by professionals. You also have different types of lenses in terms of angles. So you got wide angle lenses and telephoto lenses. Now within each of these categories you have different types. Like for example, you got fisheye lens, which is going to give you crazy distortions. They have very wide angle. You have wide angle lenses like 35 mm, 18 to 35, and then you have kind of like a mid-range, so it's 50 mm, which is, by the way, a default value of a camera in Blender. So Blender uses 50 mm lens, and the reason for that is basically because that's how we see world as humans. It's just natural way of seeing the world. And again, that's why, for example, street photography oftentimes is, shot in that focal length. Then you also have pancake lens, which are fantastic for creating images of like documents, paintings, anything that's flat and you need sharpness across the entire plane without distortions. Then you have telephoto lenses, so these are longer length lenses, so like 85 like this Otus and above. So 135, 200, 300, 400, and so on and so forth into the super telephoto range. So this will be a telephoto lens here. This one is actually telephoto, and it's also a zoom lens, 2-in-1, right? Then you have specialized lenses, like for example macro lenses, which are used for creating these macro crazy photographs of like bugs and spiders and all that. And they work in a way that you can, usually when you have something that you're photographing, you cannot place the front glass element too close to your subject because you'll not be able to focus. Now macro lens, what they do, they allow you to place your lens element really close, almost touching to the element you're shooting to your subject. Therefore the magnification is just insane. So these are macro lenses, right? And then you have also, like for example, tilt shift lenses, which are used for architecture, and you can shift the lens up and down without distorting perspective. I'll show later because actually Blender has this tool built in, which is quite interesting. So, these would be lenses in a nutshell. You don't really need to know anything more about them. And there are two key elements for lenses, okay? And you're gonna use them in Blender. One of them is focal length, and the other one is f-stop, which basically is aperture, right? Now, the longer the focal length, the more compressed the image will be. So with different lenses, you can achieve different effects. For instance, this was shot with about 35mm lens, which is a very, very wide lens, right? So you can see that it's a really vast, captures a very vast area of landscape, and it's quite broad. But then you have, for example, long lenses, which means long focal length lenses, like this one, which I think was like 300mm or more, and it gives you this almost orthographic compression of an image, right? So long lenses, 135, 200 millimeters, they're gonna be usually used for very intimate looks, okay, very intimate looks, and they're gonna be collapsing, sort of perspective will collapse, and you'll receive more of like an orthographic look, whereas wide angle lens is going to create distortions and kind of like really bend the angles of the object. Now I'll show you in a minute in practice in Blender how it looks, okay? So if you're gonna go to Blender, we're gonna grab, let's say, a cube, right? And we're going to, zoom in here. So let's grab a camera, right? And we're going to toss it into view. And let's change this format here to 2560. So it's gonna be 16 by 9. And now I'm going to lock it to view, and we're gonna switch it to, let's switch it to, let's say, to something radical like 10 millimeters, okay? So if I zoom it in, look how distorted this cube becomes, right? It's crazy. It's almost a fisheye effect, right? But if I'm going to switch it to, let's say, 300, right, I'm going to have to zoom out. The reason for that is because the magnification is insane at the moment, right? I have to zoom out. In addition to that, I'm probably going to have to change the angle a little bit so you can see how this cube is, sort of collapsed, like how compressed this look is, right? It's very compressed. It's almost orthographic. That's orthographic look, right? This is pure orthographic look. Look at this one. I'm going to zoom in here. It's almost orthographic. If I switch this lens to 600 mil, right, you're going to end up with an orthographic, basically orthographic view. Look, that's orthographic, right? So the higher you go on focal length, the more compressed look you're going to receive, right? There's a very close relation between the depth of field, so aperture, and a focal length, okay? And I want to explain this to you now. So let me just put this camera somewhere here on this plane. So I'm gonna add another camera here, okay, like this, right? So the relationship between the camera focal length and the background is as such, okay? So this is a camera, right? The closer the camera is to your subject, okay? The closer the camera is to your subject, and the longer the focal length of that camera, the more blurred the background is gonna become. The further away you get from the subject and the lower the focal length of your camera, the less blurred the background will become. This is why, for example, when you shoot landscapes, you're gonna shoot landscape at, let's say, 35 to 40 mil or even lower, and you're going to set aperture, so f-stop, to like 8 or 11 or even 16. Whereas when you shoot portraits, like for example the portrait I shot here, that was shot with 85 millimeters with, I think, 1.8. I'll probably go to camera raw and I'll be able to see that. There you go, 85 mil and 1.6 aperture, which is very shallow aperture. And I was fairly close to the model because 85 mil, you don't have to stand so far, it's about 2 meters, right? And therefore these trees which are behind are completely blurred because I'm really close, the focal length is quite high, and the aperture is really low. The lower the aperture, the more blur. The higher the aperture, the more in focus, okay? So the higher this f-stop here in the top, at the moment it's 1.6, the more things are in focus. The lower the aperture, the less things are in focus, okay? And that's the key relationship between focal length, depth of field, and the background. Now, the further away the background is from a model, the more blurred it's gonna become. That makes sense because, if your aperture is, let's say, 2, f-stop 2, right? So f2, then you're gonna have less, smaller area in focus because focal area, let me explain how focal area works, okay? If this is a camera and I'm going to bind this box to this camera, okay, so Control P and object keep transform, I think it's gonna work, right? Yes. So now watch this. If this is gonna be my area of focus, right here, right, and I'm gonna be using aperture 1.6, which is really narrow, okay, so I'm gonna have only few things in focus, only small bit in focus, only small area in focus. If you look at this picture, her hair behind her eyes are already blurry. Her hair in front of her eyes are already blurry. The field of focus is so tiny, it's about, I would say, 2, maybe 2 centimeters max, okay, maybe less. So this is why everything else is blurred, because I can only capture her eyes in focus, maybe tip of her nose, but I guarantee you that this nose is already blurrish, right? You can see that the nose is being blurred. So the eyes, the lips are in focus, but the rest is already falling out of focus, right? So the same here. The higher the f-stop, the larger gonna be the area of focus, okay? So then the area of focus moves with the camera. So when you move the lens, the area of focus is gonna follow the lens. And this is a typical mistake, which is, which I see in renders, where someone shoots at the angle like this, at a very, very narrow depth of field. So let's say something around, I don't know, let's say 1.4, right? Something like this, okay? And they have a model here. Let me just move this around here somewhere. And they have a model here like this, right? Which is really big, and it's sort of, sort of angled towards the camera. So the camera is angled at 45 degrees. remember that your plane of focus, which is, this one, will slice the object in diagonally if you're gonna be shooting diagonally. So if your area of focus is really small, this is the only bit here that you have in focus, alright? So you need to be very cautious how you set your focal length, depth of field, and where you're focusing. This is also really important. Let's say this is an object I'm shooting, right? And I'm looking through this camera here, and I'm going to move this camera back, okay, somewhere here, right? Let's just remove this. And I'm shooting with a very shallow depth of field. So let's say I'm shooting with something like let me see here, there we go. Go here and let's change it to, I don't know, let's say a 1.4, okay? And if I'm going to focus now on, let's say, this middle part in here, I guarantee you that this bit is going to be a little blurry. Same with this one. Because the way focus works, right, is like I just showed you, the focal plane will move in front of the camera, so it will slice this object in, diagonally for it. But there's another rule to it, okay? So let me just grab this cube and move it in here and expand it here, and let's just move it here, right? Field of focus, okay, will have 1/3 to 2/3 ratio in terms of area that it focuses on. Let me explain. So if this was, for example, your area of focus, right? This is the area that, that the lens can see, okay? So the lens is somewhere here, right? Let me just place the lens here, right? So we have a lens here, okay? This is our camera, okay? Here, right? And this is our, our area of focus, right? So imagine this area of focus is, again, large, right? It follows the camera. So if you focus on, on this spot here when I place the cursor, right? You will have 1/3 of the area of focus in front of the focal point and 2/3 behind it. So if you want to capture focus, for example, of a certain object, right? And you focus specifically on the area which you want to have sharp, remember that the 1/3 before that area and 2/3 behind it's still gonna be sharp. That's how area of focus works, alright? So in other words, camera will focus 1/3 before the point you're focusing on and 2/3 after, behind the point you're focusing on. And since in Blender, when you're going to use this pipette here for setting depth of field, right, that is actually bound to origin point. In this case, our focal point is going to be in the middle of this cube. It's going to be here on this origin point. But if your origin point is shifted to another place, like for example, this face, then your camera will focus on this point, which means you will have 1/3 in front of that in focus and 2/3 behind it. But anything after that is going to be blurry. Do you see how it works? Which is why I never, or almost never, use this automatic setting. What I do is I simply do it manually. So I go to, depth of field, and instead of using that, I'm using basically distance. And you can see the distance when you're gonna go to a render view. So if I'm gonna place a color here and go to something like Eevee, right? You see how blurry it is now, right? So what I'm gonna do is click on the camera, right? And I'm going to, move this manually, okay? You're not gonna be able to see anything at the moment because, let me see the focal length here, 600, right? Let's set it to 85. It's just too long. So we're too close to the object. We cannot physically focus on it. And I would do it manually like this, all right? And then I would unlock the camera from view, okay? Unlock it, zoom into where I want to have sharp, okay? And fine tune it manually like this, all right? So now if you wanted to, for example, have this area in focus, I will manually shift it to this point, yeah? So that's really something very important to remember when you're going to be focusing and using depth of field. Don't make a mistake where you're going to be shooting something that's, diagonally in a frame like this, and you're going to focus in the middle and, both ends going to be blurry. Or you, for example, focus on something on the origin point and the front of the object is going to be blurry. I see it quite a lot where someone is shooting, let's say, some kind of a sci-fi ship, and they shoot in a very shallow depth of field. They focus on the middle point, on the origin point here, and the front of the vessel is blurry. Okay, it's a terrible mistake to make, because you always need to remember that depth of field is not supposed to look cool. Okay, it's a tool. You're supposed to use it strategically to isolate your focal point of your framing, which means whatever you want to have in full focus, that's your key element, that's your key actor. Then everything else around it is a supporting background. It's elements that supports your main actor. So you cannot have your main actor blurry, because it makes no bloody sense. So when you use the depth of field, use it very cautiously, right? Very cautiously. Now, in terms of effects that you can create with lenses, we're going to be talking about later on when we're going to be talking about compositing, about glares and all that. But I want to show you something. There is a node here which you can use for compositor, right? And it's actually called lens distortion. Okay, you can plug it in here. And you're going to have two settings in here, okay? One of them is going to be distortion. This is a pinching effect here of the lens. And this one is like chromatic aberration. So basically when the light breaks and sort of distorts in very sharp sort of contrasty areas, and you get this kind of like a bluish, greenish, whatever, cast on edges, like a fringing effect. You can see it in very contrasty images, usually on cheap lenses, because expensive lenses have minimal or to none chromatic aberrations. Really expensive professional lenses, especially prime lenses, they'll have very minimal to none almost chromatic aberrations. So I wouldn't really worry about chromatic aberrations. You may use some lens distortion techniques, but I don't really like using chromatic aberrations. They look like garbage to me. That's artificially created element. Now flares you can create with a glare, and I will show you that in compositing section how to do that, but we can do it with nodes. So we've talked about perspective, which changes with the focal length, but also let's talk about heights. That's really important, right? So when you're gonna be framing something, let's grab another cube here and press period on the keyboard to zoom in. And I'm going to pop a camera in here, right? So, camera to view. And let's just pop some horizon. I think I showed it to you in one of the previous videos, but I want to re-emphasize this because this is really, really important, okay? So when you have a horizon here, right? So let's say there is a horizon here to it. Let me just put some solidification in this plane because we can't see it, and drop it down, right? Okay, that's your horizon. This is a horizon. Let's say there's a horizon, right? Now, if you're shooting something, it's actually really important how you're going to angle your camera, because you can do many things. One of them is going to be change of perspective and angle, and the other one is going to be change of the mood. Okay, so now when you shift your camera, camera down, the horizon goes up. You see that? The horizon goes up. When I'm going to shift my camera up, the horizon is going to go down. Okay, up, down. It's the other way around. So if you shoot something from the top, you're going to make it look endearing and cute, or vast and sort of more of a cinematic. If you're going to shoot from the bottom, you're going to make it look empowered. Okay, if you shoot it from the from the eye level, so from the same level, you're going to make it look sort of prominent but not too proud. Okay, which is, for example, why portraits are usually shot at at eye level. Although CEOs portraits, if you're gonna look at CEOs portraits, they're shot from the bottom to empower them. Dogs, pets, babies portraits are shot from the top a little bit because you want to make them look more endearing. And this will be amplified by a focal length. So the longer the focal length, the larger the compression, the more powerful the effect. So if you want to make something look really cute and funny, you want to use wide angle and shoot from the top. Although not always, but I'm just saying that's how it's going to look a bit more cute. If you want to make something look powerful, shoot from the floor level a little bit up and use a longer lens. And I'll show you an example. That mic is shot from the bottom with a longer lens. Do you see the compression? The angles are quite, they're not distorted, they're not bendy. It's about, I would say, 135 to 200 millimeters. The background appears very close because there's a compression. And also, look at the angle, it's from the bottom. It's very aggressive because I'm shooting up. I'm making this mech look more powerful, more scary, more intimidating, right? The same thing with the drone, although this one is an interesting one because I'm shooting from the bottom. However, I'm not that low, so it looks kind of a bit mean, but not that unapproachable. Okay, so you can kind of fine-tune this feeling in the frame. Look at these three images because they will show you three different stages of sort of a lens elevation. This is shot from the top a little bit, right? And it's a bit more cinematic, more vast, more storytelling, kind of softer, right? It's more engaging. This one is shot from the level of the vessel. So it's kind of presentable. It looks natural as if you're standing there. This one is from the bottom. It's more intimidating, more powerful. It has more oomph to it. So you got the same model shot from different angles. See what I mean? So you can use this technique. It's a very simple one to your advantage. So you can amplify the storytelling with focal length, lens angle, and the depth of field. And the last thing I want to show you, and I think I'm actually presenting this in the practical part, there's a very interesting tool that's built into Blender, and it's called Shift, and it's basically based on the tilt shift of a lens. There's something called tilt shift lens, and they use in architecture. Now the reason why we have tilt shift lenses is because of the keystone effect. So if you're gonna grab these cubes in here and put them like that, and I'm gonna go here, watch what happens to these edges. But I'm going to drop this focal length to something like 35 mil, okay, and get closer, right? Do you see how this edge is misaligned with the edge of the frame? Same here. And the lower I go, the more misaligned they're gonna be, okay? See what I mean? They distort it. Now what tilt shift lens does, and I'll show you what it does. If I align more or less myself here with these edges, so they're gonna be more or less straight, right? Not perfect, but more or less. I'm gonna go to camera settings, right? I'm gonna go to shift. Now I can actually shift my camera up or down without changing, the angle here, okay? So that's what shift does. And this is basically a tool created based on how tilt shift lens behaves in the real life. They're extremely expensive lenses, and they're used, like I said, for shooting architecture, tall buildings, etc. If you don't want to create any distortions, right? They use very often by interior photographers, etc. Right? For catalogs, or just architecture stuff. That's a really cool tool because you can adjust your camera without really shifting the angle. Because if I'm gonna shift the camera down, see, the angle will shift, right? Whereas this one doesn't. It's kind of interesting, right? So it's a cool tool, and make sure you try to use it because it could be very useful for architectural shots or like interior shots, etc. Okay, so this will be everything you need to know, I think, about lenses. Just remember to be very careful with depth of field. Remember how it works, that there is a focal plane that moves in front of the lens, and when you move the camera, when you pan the camera, the focal plane will move with it. So the smaller the aperture, the smaller the focal plane, and you're going to be slicing objects in half or diagonally. Remember that. So when you shoot something, at 90 degrees angle, that's not a problem because the focal plane aligns with your model. But the moment you shift your lens, everything changes. So be careful, especially when you shoot at this kind of angles, right? So that's important. And don't use depth of field like, mindlessly. Always think that this is a tool, and it's meant to isolate or sort of put emphasis on certain areas of your frame. So use it consciously, and always remember to use it in a way that's going to create or help you create a very pleasing composition. Yeah, it's not a toy, it's a tool. Okay guys, that's it for the lens part. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.